Hey everybody, this is Dylan with Bible A to Z. So today we're going to be covering Genesis 9 and 10. So in the last section that we looked at, it was Genesis 6 through 8, which was the story of Noah's Ark. Now in Genesis 9, we're going to look at what will happen once Noah gets off of the ark, how God will make a covenant with Noah, and some of the parameters that God will give to Noah and his family to repopulate the earth. So beginning in verse 1 of chapter 9, it says, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and terror of you will be in every living creature on the earth, every bird of the sky, every creature that crawls on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. They are placed under your authority. So right here we see in verse 1, whenever it says to be fruitful and multiply, that brings us back to Adam and Eve when God gave that same command to them. When they were populating the earth for the first time, God gave them that order. And now as Noah and his family are tasked with repopulating the earth after this global flood, God is giving them that same command. So in verse 2, God will lay out for Noah that the animals will now be in fear of them, that they have dominion over the animals, and so forth. So verse 3, it then says, every creature that lives and moves will be food for you. As I gave the green plants, I have given you everything. So here, God tells them they can eat anything. Now, this is a change from chapter 1 of Genesis, verse 29, where it says, God also said, look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the earth and every tree whose fruit contains seed. This will be food for you. So whereas before they were vegetarians, now they are free to eat whatever food that they wish. Now later on, under the Mosaic law, there will be food restrictions that God puts upon his people for dietary purposes. But then later in the New Testament, Jesus, in a discussion with Peter, it says this starting in Acts 10 verses 9 through 15. The next day, as they were traveling and nearing the city, Peter went up to pray on the roof about noon. He became hungry and wanted to eat. But while they were preparing something, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened and an object that resembled a large sheet coming down, being lowered by its four corners to the earth. In it were all the four-footed animals and reptiles of the earth, and the birds of the sky. A voice said to him, get up, Peter, kill and eat. No, Lord, Peter said, for I have never eaten anything impure and ritually unclean. Again, a second time, the voice said to him, what God has made clean, do not call impure. And so that's why nowadays, in the day in which we live, there are no food restrictions for believers, for people nowadays. Since Jesus gave that command, there is no dietary restrictions that we have to put on us that God has said to do. Now, people can be vegetarians if they want. They can eat only meat if they want, but we are free to eat whatever once God gave that command to Peter. So God never changes his moral character. He is the same always and forever. But there are times where something called progressive revelation will occur when God will give further insight to the Israelites of how he wants them to live, of actions that he wants them to take. So whereas in Genesis 1, he tells them to just eat of the fruit and the vegetables and things like that, then later he gives further revelation and he tells them that they can now eat whatever to Noah and his family. And this is not a change in his moral character, but just his standard that he wants them as far as eating practices are concerned. Verse 5, and I will require a penalty for your lifeblood. I will require it from any animal and from any human. If someone murders a fellow human, I will require that person's life. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans his blood will be shed, for God made humans in his image. All humans are made in the image of God, which makes murder so heinous in God's sight is you are taking the image of God and you're destroying that on your own without any reason for that is justified. Now, there are times in which people die, but we need to make a clear distinction where there are times where killing might occur, but that does not equate necessarily to murder. So murder and killing are not mutually exclusive things. Now, there are times in which killing may occur. So I've listed a few. So for instance, if you are in a war with another nation or group, it is not murder when they're firing at you and you're firing back and the people who you're firing against die. God commissioned wars and battles in the Bible, and people died. That is not murder. Okay, so now there would be a case in which it would be murder on the battlefield if somebody surrenders, and they're on their knees without a weapon, and then you choose to execute them. That would be murder in the battlefield. But whenever the fight is going and they are in the midst of it, then it is not murder if that person happens to die. The same way it wouldn't be murder on their part if they fired upon you and killed you. Now, that's not to say that the war is justified or unjustified or anything else, but in the instance of war, to kill combatants who are aggressive against you would not be considered murder. Another way in which it wouldn't be considered murder would be if it is a capital punishment for a criminal. So if somebody does something like murder or rape or whatever, and the government, not an individual taking, vigilante justice into his own hands type of thing, but if the government discerns that this person is guilty of this crime and the punishment given out is death, then the executioner, whoever it might be, who flips the switch on the electric chair, or pulls the lever for the guillotine, or gives the shot for the poison, or whatever that might be, whatever day and age, the executioner would not be guilty of murder in carrying out the government's order for this execution. So in Romans 13, it says this in verses 3 and 4, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you want to be unafraid of the one in authority? Do what is good, and you will have its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry the sword for no reason. For it is God's servant, an avenger that brings wrath on the one who does wrong." So the government does not carry the sword in vain, is what it's saying. It's not saying that people take matters into their own hands and kill somebody who they feel like has wronged them. But the government does have a time and a place where when somebody does truly wicked things, they are justified in taking that person's life. Not on an individual basis, but on the basis of the court of law. So another way in which killing would not be equated with murder would be if there is self-protection happening. So whenever we're talking about self-protection, like if somebody breaks into your home and they've got a knife or a gun and you defend yourself or your loved ones, and in the process of protecting your loved ones, you subdue the criminal and he ends up dying, that's not murder. That is protecting your loved ones, protecting yourself against a criminal who is doing wrong. So there would be a difference there. In fact, Jesus, he's talking to the disciples toward the end of his ministry there, and they're talking to him, and he says, they say, "Lord," they said, "look, here are 2 swords. That is enough," he told them. He didn't say, "Hey, sell those swords. You don't need swords to protect yourselves. Just, go about your business. Use those swords for extra bread." Jesus said that's enough. You don't necessarily need 45 swords, guys, but if you have some swords to protect yourselves, that's well and good according to the Lord. And, I'm sure that he understood that with those swords, they would likely be used or possibly be used at some point, and that wouldn't be wrong in using to protect yourself or your loved ones. And then finally, the last one that I thought of for a difference between killing and murder would be an accident. If something occurs and just by an accident, something were to happen to where a person dies, that is not you trying to kill somebody. That's something that accidentally happened. But God has a very high standard because he knows that all people, and we should know, are made in his image, and that to take that life on purpose out of just revenge or spite is something that is not going to be excused in God's eyes. And it's something that we need to understand is a very serious crime if somebody chooses to murder another person. So God was laying that out right there in Genesis 9:6. Now, skipping down a little bit to verse 11, it says, "I establish my covenant with you that never again will every creature be wiped out by floodwaters. There will never again be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all future generations. I have placed my bow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I form clouds over the earth and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all the living creatures. Water will never again become a flood to destroy every creature. So whenever we look and we see the rainbow in the sky, maybe after a huge rain, a downpour, a storm, or whatever, we should remember that as God's promise to never again flood the earth like he did in the days of Noah. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't localized floods that occur or that there isn't downpourings and things like that on a local level, but on a worldwide level, never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth like Noah did, or God did in the days of Noah. And whenever we see the rainbow, we should remember that God is a promise-keeping God, that this is just one of numerous reminders for us of who God is, that he means what he says, and he says what he means, and he promised to never again flood the earth in this way, that he was going to be with Noah and his family in the coming days as well. So now going to verse 20 of chapter 9, it says, Noah, as a man of the soil, began by planting a vineyard. He drank some of the wine, became drunk, and uncovered himself inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a cloak and placed it over both their shoulders, and walking backward, they covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father naked. When Noah woke from his drinking and learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Canaan is cursed. He will be the lowest of slaves to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be Shem's slave. Let God extend Japheth. Let Japheth dwell in the tents of Shem. Let Canaan be Shem's slave. So in this story, Noah gets drunk after coming out of the ark. Now, there's debate about whether wine was able to be fermented and produce alcoholic beverages before the flood or not, or whether it was as potent before the flood or not. The Bible doesn't tell us that. But what we do know is whether on accident or on purpose, or maybe he was just trying to drink a little bit. He knew it was going to have some alcoholic taste to it, but he didn't realize the potency, whatever. Noah drinks wine. He gets drunk. He unclothes himself. And then his youngest son, Ham, sees him basically in this shameful, debased state. And instead of covering him up, or instead of just leaving it to himself, he basically goes and makes fun of his dad to his two brothers who are outside, Shem and Japheth, and he's kind of making sport of his dad's shameful behavior. But what's interesting is that as a result of that, God gives out these blessings and these curses, and the curse that God gives is not to Ham, but it's to his son Canaan. And so some people are a bit confused because it's like, well, if Ham is the one who did the wrong, then why are you punishing Canaan, who was he was innocent of this, and it doesn't quite seem right. Now, the Bible does say that God will not punish the child for the crimes of the father. That's in Ezekiel 18:20. So God would not be punishing Canaan or cursing Canaan for something that Ham had done. Now, some people would say that maybe Ham was involved, but just isn't mentioned in the scripture here. But if that's the case, that's just a slippery slope of be careful, because you can say a lot of what's not written in the Bible about all kinds of things that aren't written in scripture. So we should first and foremost just go with what we know and what the Bible clearly says, which is that it was Ham and not Canaan, but it was Ham who went to see his father, and he saw him and told his brothers about it. So God does not punish the child for the crimes of the father, but there are times in which the children or grandchildren are collateral damage because of the sins of the father or grandfather. You just think about if a parent has some serious sins in their life, then that might affect the child at a young age or older age. You name the sin, and that can play a problem in the child's upbringing because of that. So Deuteronomy 5:9 says, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. So just naturally, a person who hates God, who is living a wicked life, it's not because God is cursing the child, but they unfortunately are kind of the collateral damage that happens when people choose to rebel and to go their own way against the Lord. And this seems to be what's happening with Ham and Canaan. Ham is the one who's guilty, but Canaan will likely have to see the negative fruit of his father's sin. And perhaps that's the strongest curse or punishment that could have been given to Ham, is to be told that your son will now have to deal with the consequences of what you are the reason for. So because of Ham's sin, God's telling him that now your son will have to deal with this because of your wickedness. Now, chapter 10 is what is referred to as the Table of Nations. So in this, we see from Noah, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, their lineage has 70 nations that are listed in chapter 10 that all came from those 3 sons. Now, the typical custom of presenting sons would be in descending order from oldest to youngest. But in this case, in the Table of Nations, it lists it from youngest to oldest. And this is probably because then the last one that's mentioned is Shem, which will be a great contrast but to see his overall godly lineage. And then chapter 11, we have the Tower of Babel. So those kind of going side by side with each other, we are able to more easily contrast the godly line of Shem with the ungodly people who were building the Tower of Babel. So we saw in Genesis 6 and 7 that Noah was blameless, righteous, he walked with God, but then he's over here getting drunk, he's getting naked, he's basically bringing shame to himself. This should remind us that nobody, no matter how godly we may be, is beyond messing up, is beyond falling into serious sin, and there's consequences that those sins bring. And then his son as well, because of Noah's sin, then he sins, and then because of his sin, his son was affected, Canaan. And sin does have a snowball effect sometimes, not just in terms of how it affects us, but how it can oftentimes affect those closest to us as well. So I hope that this lesson was informative for you, and I hope you have a blessed day. Take care.